All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I think just past noon here, so we're going to kick things off. Just as a way of a quick introduction, I'm Cyrus Matheson. I'm the lead solutions architect here at Validere. I'm joined by my colleague Max Bennett, another member of our solutions architecture team. And this afternoon, we're going to be talking about handling error compliance and permit management from within the Validere platform. We're going to be walking through a couple of different use cases and basically describing how you guys can approach these problems. We're familiar with them, and a number of our customers have dealt with these in the past. So we're going to dig into those in a little bit of detail. Before I pass it off to Max here to introduce some of the use cases that we're going to be dealing with, just a quick reminder that we're going to be leaving some time at the end to do Q&A. So as we're going through the session, if you have any questions, just type those into the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them at the end. In addition to that, we're also going to be running a poll. So basically, you have an option to vote on some of these options as we're basically completing this webinar. So I've just made the poll active. Feel free to go in and vote on any of the questions and options as we're sort of beginning the presentation. So with that, Max, I'm going to pass it off to you, and you can sort of introduce some of the concepts we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Cyrus, and thanks everyone for joining. So as a quick overview of the agenda for today, we're going to start off with an overview of the kind of the primary use cases we've identified within the error compliance space. Then we're going to dig a bit deeper into each of these use cases and talk about what Validere's approach is to solving them and to making them a bit easier to manage. And then finally, we're going to jump into the Validere product and look at a demo of what these actually look like when we look at our solutions inside of our product. So starting off here with an overview of the use cases. So the aspects of error compliance where we've seen the most in terms of pain points and challenges for our clients and more broadly in the industry are outlined here. So starting on the left side with calculating error emissions and then tracking them against permitted limits. And oh, by the way, these should line up relatively well with the poll options. So yeah, make sure to vote in the poll on which one of these tends to be the most challenging for your specific company. So starting on the left, yeah, calculating error emissions, tracking them against permitted limits. Then in the middle, we have the piece around monitoring emissions and identifying threshold exceedances in real time against hourly threshold limits. And then on the right, managing inspections and testing as part of ongoing compliance requirements like Quad OA, Quad OB, Quad J. And then across the top, all of these are enabled by effective management of permit application processes and having a structured but highly customizable permit record keeping system, which we'll see what this looks like, at least in Validere, when we jump into the product in a moment. So we're going to go into more detail in the following slides, as well as during the product demo on each of these use cases, their associated pain points and challenges, and how Validere enables greater efficiency, visibility, and improved outcomes for each of them. We won't really be touching on the compliance inspections and testing piece, this bottom right box, in this webinar, since we covered this at great length in prior webinars and blog posts. So in particular, some of you may have attended our webinar back in December, where we discussed how Validere enables Quad OB compliance through our LDAR implementations. And I think we'll share the link to that webinar in the chat for any of you who weren't able to attend that, who are interested in our compliance inspection and testing offerings. And in general, if you'd like to learn more about these compliance inspection and testing use cases and how we can support them through Validere, please get in touch with us after the webinar, and we'd be more than happy to chat about these topics in more detail. Okay, awesome. So now we're going to jump into the specifics of some of these use cases. So starting off with the permit application piece. The main use case and challenge or pain point here is the coordination among potentially a large number of different parties that need to work together on these applications, that need to share documents, upload them, download them, make edits to them, and have all these changes be tracked. And in general, there's the coordination of tasks, especially with the possibility of several different iterations of review prior to submitting applications, with different required actions depending on the type of update, the type of permit, and other application-specific inputs, which yields a overall non-linear process, which can be pretty complex and difficult to manage. And so our solution to this involves two of our product features, or largely involves two of our product features, workflows and forms, which really help facilitate the sharing of information and documents and manage the complex task execution while making the overall process, this overall complex permitting or air application permit process as transparent as possible. It also helps with visibility for managing the air permit application processes for whoever is responsible for overseeing the submission of these permits on an ongoing basis. And then lastly, when it comes to receiving permits and then uploading the permit limits and emission factors into the product, this can be integrated into these application workflows, and it can be done through a variety of supported data ingestion pathways, which includes entry through the product's front end, SFTP, API integrations, among others. And this is all done while ensuring traceability back to the associated permit application and tying these permits to the applicable emitting assets in the product. Then for our next use case that we're going to show off in the product, we're going to talk about emissions calculations for air compliance and tracking these against permit limits on an ongoing or rolling basis. And so the main challenges that we've been seeing from customers and more broadly in the industry around this use case is ingesting and consolidating data from multiple disparate sources and then running calculations using this data on a rolling basis. So this includes data like gas analyses, volumetric flow data, and then the results of those air permit applications, the permit data for running the calculations, and then for comparing the emissions results against the permitted limits on an ongoing basis. And the idea here for how Validere provides use in this use case is that regardless of the entry point of each of these pieces of disparate data or the source system that they're sourced from, these can all be combined into the same calculations and then compared in the same set of dashboards to visualize these air emissions on an ongoing basis. And the intention is to use this data to then allow for risk minimization when it comes to permit exceedances, and then even allow for operational optimization to make operational decisions based on permitted thresholds and emissions results on an ongoing basis throughout the course of a 12-month rolling period. And so these calculations can be run via what we call estimation methods in Validere, and then surfaced via these interactive dashboards that we're going to show in the product shortly to really allow for those operational decisions to be made with as much information as effectively as possible. And then finally, for our third use case that we're going to talk about as we jump into the product, this is the real-time emissions monitoring against hourly thresholds. So on top of the annual emissions limits, there's also these hourly permitted thresholds, which require monitoring on a much shorter time scale. And given that the magnitude of penalties for exceedances are at a high level based on the duration of them, severity, and then corrective action responses to those exceedances, it's obviously very important to have a timely notification of these exceedances and then an effective and well-informed response to them. And in Validere, this is addressed through ingesting measurement data, which can be used to track emissions at any level of time granularity, and then using dashboards to visualize these emissions on an hourly basis against the hourly thresholds, maintaining a log of permit exceedances, and then finally using notifications to ensure that exceedances are responded to in a timely and well-informed manner. Okay, at this point, we're going to jump into the product, and in that same order, starting with the streamlining of permit applications, we're going to talk through each of these use cases and what it looks like to support these in Validere. So for the application, permit applications, these are first and foremost based in the workflows feature of Validere. And so at a high level, workflows, these are our way of representing an arbitrary and entirely customizable set of user tasks and automated system actions in our product. And these workflows can have associated rules for assigning tasks. They can have complex triggering logic, which can be based on some predefined cadence of when these workflows should be kicked off, or they can be triggered in response to some user action. They can also have due dates, notifications, and a variety of other configurable parameters that we're going to see in a moment as we jump into the air permit application workflow. So we have some high-level information about the workflow template itself, which is essentially a blueprint for how these air permit applications should unfold, and an entirely configurable one. And so looking at the configuration for this outlines what this application process looks like. So starting with the trigger, which in this case is the request for a permit, and then following that, we have a set of user tasks, which are the white boxes here, and workflow automations or system actions that are taken without any user intervention and allow for a high degree of customization over how this workflow unfolds. And so in this case, we have a set of very non-linear steps which are assigned to different user groups and users. So in this case, there's a step to draft the permit application package at the start of this workflow, which is assigned to the air permit management group of users, whereas, and this involves the submission of a form within the Validere product, which is another feature that gets used throughout these air permit applications quite frequently. Whereas we could also have a step that's assigned to a different user group, the air permit application group of users, and this involves the submission of a data set. And so those are just a couple examples of user tasks within these workflows that are highly customizable and configurable and allow you to represent essentially any type of compliance process or business process within the product. And then in addition to those user tasks, we also have these automations, which in this case, we might have some that allow for branching of this workflow. So different branches to be taken depending on information submitted as part of certain tasks within this workflow. And so just taking one step back before I jump into a bit more of the specifics around this air permitting process, this is an example for streamlining the air permitting application process and ensuring that all the tasks are being executed by the right personnel within the appropriate timeframes. However, this concept of workflows that I'm talking about here can be extended to essentially any compliance activity or business process. So this could include things like health and safety reporting, engine testing for Quad J, LDAR inspections and corrective actions for Quad OA and Quad OB, third-party measurement processes such as emissions event detection using satellites or your flyovers, alternative fugitive emissions management programs, and then even things like maintenance and work order management. So just to show another example of our health and safety configuration, this is a separate workflow that is able to be configured in a different way using different user tasks, different assigned users and groups of users, and different automations to achieve the outcomes of that health and safety incident reporting process. Okay, so jumping into some of our specific instance of this workflow. So this is one individual process that has been followed in this case to completion for this air permitting based on this air permitting application blueprint. And so in this case, we have a full inventory of all the tasks that have been completed as part of this workflow, and a full log of when they were due, what type of task was completed, both the user tasks as well as these Validere assistant automations or system actions that happen in the background and ensure this workflow is progressing in the right way without user intervention required at every step. And so we can click into individual tasks within this workflow and understand which user completed them, when they were completed. And in the case of this permit application package draft, we can actually click into it, see the information that was submitted at this step, and it's all kept in record on this workflow. And then any attachments, such as the permit application form, can be viewed and downloaded directly from within this form. And potentially, if there were ever edits made or edits required to one of these permit applications, those edits could be made in the product and then reflected in the workflow. So we could jump through each of the individual tasks and pull out information as I just showed for that example. But another feature that Validere has that makes it easy to pull information out of these complicated workflows, whether it's air permit applications or Quad OJ engine testing or Quad J engine testing or Quad OA and B LDAR, is we can use the Validere assistant to summarize these workflows, which can be quite complicated. They can take different branches. They can have cyclical components where certain steps need to be repeated until a certain outcome is achieved. And oftentimes it's easier to pull out this AI-generated summary of a workflow than it is to sift through individual tasks. And so this is going to pull out key information about this air permit application. It's going to provide a timeline of the actions taken with the associated users involved in those actions, and it's going to make it as easy as possible to pull key information out of these complicated air permit application processes without having to sift through the individual tasks involved. And then I mentioned back when I was talking about this use case more broadly, that some component of this is going to involve the upload of permit limits and maintaining a record of those at the asset level. So clicking into an open task that involves the upload of permit limits and emission factors, this is a separate task where instead of submitting a form like I showed previously, this is going to involve the upload of some data set. And we can use this download template button to get a structured but configurable Excel template, which can then be filled out or populated using an Excel file received from when that permit is issued. And then we can re-upload it to ensure that this data is ingested onto the appropriate assets within the platform. And I can open a Excel file and submit the data onto this permit task. And now checking out a workflow where this has been completed, we can see an instance where this data has been uploaded. We can view the data submission to understand what was submitted. And download the original submission of data. And in addition to that, this data submission is linked to the workflow as well as to the appropriate assets. So if I click into a specific asset on which we've submitted these permit limits and emission factors, under the permit uploads tab, we can actually see a log of all of the permit limits and emission factors that have been uploaded and associated with this equipment. We can click into them and we can get all the information around these permit limits to make it as easy and traceable as possible to upload this information into Validere and then track it at an equipment by equipment basis. And then finally, the last piece of this air permit application process and streamlining it is managing it at the highest level. So this is understanding at an overview which permit applications are in process, which have been completed, which are required or outstanding for certain facilities or certain equipment. So we can see an overview of permits by status and see how these applications have progressed from the initial application draft all the way to permits being issued and uploaded into Validere. This can be done at any level of aggregation, so by operating state, by facility type, and then we can apply any arbitrary set of filters or settings to this dashboard to get the views that we're interested in, to understand these at a glance how these permit applications are progressing. We can also get a log of these individual permit applications with links to the associated workflows in the platform and key information around things like the status, when the permit was requested, which group of users in the product is required to address the active task associated with an open permit application process, and some other information at the individual permit application level. And then finally, we can have an entirely configurable set of charts, widgets, and other visuals to gain immediate and actionable insights around ongoing and completed air permit applications to ensure that from a management perspective, there's clear visibility into these applications as they go from requested all the way to being issued and then uploaded into Validere. And I think with that, I'm going to hand things over to Cyrus to talk about our next two use cases on permit emissions tracking and real-time emissions threshold monitoring.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Max. That was great. Let me just share my screen here. I'll pull this up as we kind of dig into the next two use cases here. So once you've kind of completed the process that Max has just described as an operator, typically one of the big challenges that we see customers facing is they're in a position where they basically need to figure out how to store and access the key pieces of information related to the permits they've just received. So the use cases that I'm going to be walking through are going to specifically deal with how you can use the Validere platform both to ingest data related to permits, but then how you can also track your own operational performance relative to those permits and essentially the boundaries that are defined by those permits. So the primary mechanism for ingesting some of the key information related to any one individual permit, at least within the Validere platform, we manage through the forms feature. So as an operator, what we can do is we can actually create specific form templates that are designed to capture custom types of permit data that you can in sort of turn basically begin to associate against your own asset base. So when I look at the form category sets that we've defined in this specific account, you'll see that we have one for permit uploads. And when I click into permit uploads, we basically have a selection of custom templates, each of which have been designed to capture a certain type of permit data. So in this case, we have one for capturing permits for normal operations, and we have one for capturing permits related to SSM operations. So when I click into the normal operations template, what I'm basically presented with is a summary of all of the information that was extracted from individual permits and we're now storing in the Validere platform. So scrolling around in this table, what I can see is that this specific permit is focusing on capturing permit limits. So in this case, for individual pieces of equipment at given facilities, this permit is defining various emission limits, various emissions thresholds, and those are all being stored on the corresponding pieces of equipment. So in this case, we're defining things like VOC permit limits for both tons per year and pounds per hour. And really depending on sort of the specific use case or the nature of your own organization and asset base, the types of information that the permit is collecting can vary a lot. So in this case, I can actually click into an individual piece of equipment if I want to get more information about what's happening at this given location. When I do that, I get a summary of all of the details about what is, in this case, a boiler or heater that's natural gas fired. Since specifically we're interested in the permits associated with this piece of equipment, we'll notice right away that there's a tab that's been created up top called Permit Uploads. And when I click into that, basically what I'm presented with is a list of all of the permit data that's been uploaded for this specific piece of equipment sort of in history. And in this case, because there's only been one permit uploaded so far, there's only one entry in this table. But basically, as you made modifications to this piece of equipment, as your operations evolved, as your permitting requirements changed, you might start to see more permits come in here correspondingly with changes in, permit limits, emissions thresholds, so on and so forth. Now, in addition to storing and tracking the actual specific permits here, you can see which permit limits apply for a given piece of equipment at any given point in time. So when I come into the records section for this piece of equipment and I navigate to our air permitting reporting group, I can see that for each given month, there's a value that's being pulled, and that's actually sourcing back to the specific permit form that I uploaded for this piece of equipment based on an effective date. So in this case, if I want to see what the values are for April 2025, I would probably do an automation. And basically what will happen here is it'll pull in all of the relevant information for this specific piece of equipment based on that permit form that I'd previously submitted. So if I actually want to get some details on where the values for given rates came from, I can click into it. And it's actually going to reference back to that permit upload that I had originally made. So in this case, this is coming from a permit that was effective as of January 2024. And when I click into it, what I'm actually looking at is that same permit submission that Max was just talking about. But this time the data has actually been pulled through so that I can now begin to use it, both for the purposes of ensuring that I'm remaining within regulatory compliance, but also in some instances, I may actually be sourcing values from this permit into specific calculations that I'm performing in the platform. So from this point, essentially what we've done is we've defined key pieces of permit information on a specific piece of equipment. The next piece that we really need to take into account is how we actually want to perform air emissions calculations on that. So within the Validere platform, for those of you who are familiar with it, the way that we deal with this is through what we call estimation methods. So on this same piece of equipment, again, I'm looking at this same boiler heater with the same permits. I can click into estimation methods, and basically this breaks down all of the calculations that are being used to determine various pollutant masses based on operating data that we're feeding into the system. So for this specific engine, I can see that we have two calculations. One of them is a subpart C style calc, and the other is an AP42 style calculation. Because we're talking about air emissions, non-GHG stuff, I'm going to look at the emissions from natural gas combustion, the AP42 style one. So when I click into this emissions overview, I basically get a breakdown of all of the specifics associated with this given calculation. So in this case, I can actually see the emissions library or the calculation library that this came from. Again, this is AP42. I actually get a reference to the specific calculator name. So in this case, this one's calculating criteria pollutants and a collection of other sort of key air emissions outputs. If I want, I can actually get a reference back to the specific calculation methodology document that calculation is being sourced from. So again, this is AP42. I can see the equations that are being used. But most importantly, if I click into the results tab, I can actually get a breakdown of all of the inputs and all of the outputs associated with each individual period where this calculation has been run on this given piece of equipment. So in this case, I can see the key inputs here, which for this given calculation, the volume of gas combusted, basically what is the volume that's being fed through this natural gas boiler on any given month. You can see the key emissions factors that are being used for specific pollutants, so carbon monoxide, NOx, so on and so forth. And then if I scroll all the way to the right, I can actually see the key output. So basically, what are the corresponding masses of these various air emissions that have actually been calculated for April, March, February, whichever months I'm kind of interested in. So this basically gets us to a point where we both have the permit data that we're interested in basically tracking our performance against, and we also have a whole bunch of air calculation outputs that we've now run through the platform. So the task that kind of remains for operators is basically figuring out how they can aggregate these disparate data points into one consolidated view so that they can begin to understand how their operations are comparing to basically their approved permit limits. They want to make sure that they're not falling outside the boundaries of what their basically what the permit says they can do. So the way that we accomplish that within the Validere platform is through the creation of essentially custom dashboard views. So if I click into the dashboards tab, you'll see that we've basically created a specific dash that is essentially summarizing a lot of the information that I've shown there. So all of the permit limits that we've brought into the platform, all of the calculation outputs that we've run on specific pieces of equipment, and all of this is getting aggregated in this air emissions summary dashboard. So when I click into this dashboard, what we're going to see is basically a breakdown of all of those calculations that are being rolled up to various levels of my organizational hierarchy so that I can basically evaluate how my performance is trending relative to the levels that I need to essentially monitor and remain within. So this first table, basically this view at the top, I'm getting an aggregate emissions breakdown, and I can decide what level I want these emissions results to be brought up to. So in this case, what's happening is I'm seeing basically a breakdown of my key pollutants that have been calculated using the estimation methods that I was just describing, rolled up based on equipment type. But if I wanted to see those rolled up to a higher level, so for instance, if I wanted to see them specific to any one facility, I could change my aggregation level. And now I'm basically seeing a breakdown of those emissions totals, but for only one given location. So in this case, I can see my gas plant emissions and the key pollutant categories. So essentially, what is my NOx total, my VOC totals, my particulate matter totals. And depending on what set of filters I'm applying, I can see essentially more or fewer facilities, or I can see different types of basically emissions calculations roll-ups. By default, this dashboard is showing rolling 12s, but if I wanted to, I could actually change the time range that we were looking at so that I could get longer windows, or I could get shorter windows, depending on what I'm trying to report and what information I'm trying to surface. Now, in addition to basically the high-level roll-up, you're also interested in tracking your emissions outputs relative to your actual permit limits. So if I scroll a little bit farther down in this dashboard, I can actually get a specific breakdown for each of the pieces of equipment where I've run these. So what I'm looking at in the second table is for a given facility, all of the pieces of equipment that have had permit limits uploaded for it, along with the corresponding emissions calculations for the primary pollutant categories. So for instance, if I look at my heater 1 here, I can see that I've actually emitted 5.73 tons of NOx relative to my annual limit of 2.82. And so as a consequence, what the table is highlighting to me is I've exceeded that rolling 12 threshold. Obviously, there's a number of instances within this specific table where that's happened, more so for demonstration purposes than anything. But basically, I need to rectify the situation. Likely, I'm going to need to submit some follow-on reports. Another piece to call out here is that depending on the nature of your permit and depending on the nature of your operations, you might have different permit limit apply. So in this case, we have both malfunction and normal operations that are all being tracked in the same table. So depending on essentially sort of the operational specifics associated with when an emission was realized, you might have different permit limits that you need to be tracking against. And so all of that information can kind of be summarized and presented in one format through this table here. Additionally, if you want, you can actually also mess around with things like your warning threshold. So for instance, in this case, we've set a warning threshold for 50%. So basically, if over a rolling 12 period, my calculations are indicating that I've emitted more than half of my permitted total, I want to get a little notice. So in this case, I can see that for my second amine reboiler, I'm over 50% for my annual total, and I may want to do something to ensure that I don't exceed that, in this case, 9.68 tons per year threshold. And then finally, if I just want to get sort of an understanding of where my permits are at from sort of an operational perspective, I can scroll down here to the bottom. And this basically shows me when I've been issuing permits, the types of permits that I've been issuing, based on the operational type, when was that permit last updated. This is more so intended to give you some insight into basically when permits may potentially be coming, when they're due for renewal, when they're going to expire. This is essentially just summarizing a lot of the information that would have been originally ingested in that permit upload form category that I was talking about. But this is in a slightly more understandable format and hopefully surfaces some of the key points in a cleaner sort of vision. So this is a sort of quick breakdown of that primary use case, the first one that Max was talking about, where we're talking about these things on typically an annual basis. The next use case I'm going to kind of dig into is a little bit more specific to higher resolution data. And this is basically where you as an operator are interested in understanding in more real time how your various assets are performing from an emissions perspective relative to their available permit thresholds. So to do this, I'm actually going to look at a specific flare stack, or actually a set of flare stacks. So in this case, I'm clicking into one of the flare stacks that's operating at the gas plant I was just looking at. When I do that, again, same as when we looked at that boiler, I'm getting a bunch of that high level information about this specific piece of equipment, namely its location, things about how it's being operated. But notably, I'm going to see that there's some volumetric flows at the bottom here. The volumetric flows are basically ways of tracking volume-based data for specific pieces of equipment. So we might upload things like flare volumes through here. The one that I'm interested in right now is actually a flow that's been gas metered. So essentially the configuration that I'm going to be walking through is one where a flare has been created in the Validere platform. The operator actually has a sensor or a meter out in the field that's tracking flare volumes in real time. And we're going to ingest that data into the Validere platform for the purposes of basically running hourly calculations to make sure that they're not exceeding their hourly permit thresholds. So to basically see what this looks like, I'm going to click into this metered flow, and you'll see at the bottom here, we have this device. Devices within the Validere platform you can think of as sort of gauges or sensors. It's anything that sort of has like a real life counterpoint that's probably collecting real time or time series style of data. So in this case, we have a flow meter style device, and this is basically taking volumetric data about what's being fed into this flare on an hourly basis. So if I want to see what that data actually looks like, I can click into this specific device instance. I can see the measurement type that it's tracking. I can see the units that it's tracking in. In this case, we're getting volumetric data in MCF. But if I actually want to see the measurement data that's been ingested from this operator's system, I can click into the measurements tab. So here I get sort of a time series chart. I'm going to go back a few months just to look at some older data. And in February 2025, I can see that there's a whole collection of volumetric data that was tracked by this specific device on, in this case, the flare stack that I was originally looking at. So at this point, what we have is the permits that were ingested for that specific flare stack. We have real-time volumetric data that we've ingested from the device. And through other channels, we've also ingested other sort of key pieces of data that you might want to include in sort of a real-time emissions calculation. So specifically, another piece of information that we're going to use in the calculations I'm showing here is gas analyses. So basically, this flare being fed to it, and we're tracking the compositions of that gas through a gas analysis form. So on some basis, this operator will be uploading gas analysis data as they're receiving it from their labs. And we can in turn use that gas analysis along with the permit data and the real-time device data to basically give them an understanding of how their emissions are performing hour over hour. And similar to that last sort of experience that we described, a lot of this information is going to be consolidated in the dashboard. So to show you guys what that looks like, I'm going to go back to the dashboards tab. And this time I'm going to look at a specific dashboard that's been set up for flare emissions tracking on an hourly basis. So here I'm going to click into our flare air emissions monitoring. And the dash that we're going to have brought up is in some regards similar to that first one. But again, because we're dealing with higher resolution data, the outputs are going to be on sort of an hourly basis as opposed to on an annual one. So this first tab, essentially what's happening here is it's using a lot of that same permit information. So essentially both the annual permit limits and the hourly permit limits to give you an understanding of how your emissions performance is trending relative to essentially the thresholds that have been set by that permit upload. So in this case, what this first tab is doing is it's actually using the hourly volumetric data that you've ingested into the platform through that device. It's running calculations on an hour by hour basis, and it's aggregating those up so that you can see, based on hourly data, how is my performance relative to my annual thresholds. So in this case, what I can see is for a collection of flares within my account, how I'm trending relative to my permitted limits. So only in 2 cases does it appear I'm exceeding for specific pollutant categories. In this case, flare stack 1 at my 37th facility, I'm exceeding on my SOx, and then another one I'm exceeding on my NOx. Similarly, on the right here, I can see how basically for key pollutant categories, if I'm exceeding or trending below my 100% permit threshold limit, so basically have I exceeded it or not, this is basically a different way of visualizing a lot of that same information. But coming down here, if you want to get sort of a more flexible view on it, you can start to play around with the specific pollutants that you're looking at. So in this case, what I'm getting is a breakdown of all of the actual annualized emissions outputs from those hourly calculations that I'm performing, and I can get an understanding for how my flares are performing for certain pollutant categories. So in this case, I can see that only one of my flares, which has been highlighted in red here, has actually exceeded its annual threshold. If I wanted to change the pollutant category, let's say I want to look at SOx, you can see that there's one down here that's only emitted, a handful of, I guess it's a decent amount at this point, but it's exceeded its annual permit, although it's emitted comparatively less relative to some of the other flares. And then finally, if I come down here, I can get an even more specific view, which basically breaks down how much I've actually emitted relative to what my actual permit limit is. And then you can actually see a lot of that hourly data and the corresponding emissions calculations trended on a graph over time. Now, to take this down to the even finer grain, slightly more detailed level, we'll click into the hourly monitoring tab. And basically what's happening in the hourly monitoring tab is we're taking a lot of that information that was ingested through the device, along with the gas analyses and the permits, and we're running calculations to determine whether or not exceedances are occurring hour after hour. So for this specific example, what I'm looking at is a flare stack at my 48th compressor station. I'm looking at NOx. And what I'm seeing right here is basically an hour after hour breakdown of the emissions calculations that we've run within the platform, specifically identifying time periods where we exceeded that 1 hour threshold. So it appears that in the month of February, there were 10 exceedances observed, all of them within the span of, I think, 5 days. And this table on the bottom right actually calls out the specific instances where that exceedance took place. So you can play around with these visuals. The intention is really to give you more insight into basically how your flare stacks or your engines or really sort of whatever pieces of equipment you're operating at your various facilities are performing from an emissions perspective, but on a more real-time, more granular basis. So essentially what we're looking at here is a more high resolution view of your emissions. The idea being that you can sort of respond to occurrences in the field more real time when you're bringing in data like this, basically higher resolution, higher frequency data, and relying on the platform to run those emissions calculations in real time. So I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna see if we have any questions. I'm not sure if we had any major ones, but before we wrap this up, I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen for a moment here. So yeah, I think what we've kind of gone through is sort of the summary of the 3 main use cases that we were sort of, I guess, originally presenting. I'm gonna move over and look at the Q&A just to make sure we have anything. Okay, we've got a question here. For the emissions calculations, where are changes to emissions factors made if needed? So that's a great question. I'll share my screen again just to kind of dig into where that can be handled. Moment. So changes to emissions factors, the answer to that question is going to depend on which of the sort of two primary use cases we're talking about. For the estimation method style calculation, a lot of those changes are actually going to be made within the estimation method themselves. So for instance, if I go back to that piece of equipment I was looking at, let me just pull that up again. I'm going to open up this gas plant and I'll look at a specific instance of this. So in this case, I'm looking at an amine boiler. When I click into the estimation methods, again, I can see the calculations that are being used. Here, I'll look at the air emissions one. The specific emissions factors can be managed through this tab right here called configuration. What I'm looking at in this instance is obviously a very specific example of a very specific calculator, but this same concept can be done in bulk. But basically, when I click into it, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of emissions factors that are being used. In this case, the calculation is using default AP42 style calculations, but if you as a user had done testing, for instance, or you wanted to use organization or asset specific emissions factors, you can actually change them directly through the configuration tab. So in this case, if I wanted to change my NOx emissions factor, I could say I'm going to set this to 0.1. And I'll set that for all time. And I'll save that. And now what that means is when I run this calculation subsequently, instead of the default AP42 style calculation, I'm going to be running it with the NOx emissions factor that I've defined for that specific calculation. Again, the sort of specific pattern that I've followed here is for updating one individually, but you typically would do this probably for a collection of assets and a collection of equipment in one go. So that's a sort of brief overview of how you would handle that for any, I don't know, I guess like a single piece of equipment. Perfect. Okay, we got one more question. Is Validere going to take the place of my current air permitting consultant, or is Validere just taking an already completed air permit and breaking it down for use in the platform? That's a great question. So the intention, I think, for the platform isn't so much to, I guess, replace an air permit consultant. Instead, the intention is more so to make for a consolidated system where all of the information that you would need to do ongoing air compliance can be aggregated. So in sort of a real world implementation, you would likely still work with air consultants to do things like facilitating your air permit applications, essentially managing the human side of the operation. But the data, the integrations with external systems, the actual calculations, the generation of the report, a lot of that can now be handled from within the platform. So that's kind of the intention behind what we've been showing here. Hopefully that at least somewhat addresses your question. Perfect. And another question, is there a way to generate a report for annual emissions? Yes, the answer is absolutely there is. Depending on what type of report you're specifically trying to create, Validere has a collection of options. One of the most common ways to generate reports is through our report generation feature, which is aptly named. So for instance, I don't believe that this account has anything air emissions specific, but hopefully it'll communicate the idea. Basically, through the platform, we have the ability to configure specific formatted report outputs. So for instance, a lot of clients will be interested in creating subpart W style reports, which are very specifically formatted reports that need to be sent to regulators. We can work with clients to configure those same reports for them based on data contained within the platform, depending on what types of reports they're trying to create. So for instance, if I wanted to create a subpart W report, we would apply that report configuration into your account. And basically, there's logic embedded into the back end of your basically your Validere instance that tells these reports where to access the pieces of data they need inside your account in order to basically pre-populate those report outputs. So if I want to look at a specific subpart W report, I'll just export this. I may not be able to share everything. I don't think I'm able to share the full thing, but basically what I've just exported is essentially an Excel version of a subpart W report that has been pre-populated with data for my specific assets inside all of the tabs. And that same concept can be applied to really sort of any style of air emissions report that you might be required to submit to regulators, or even just internal reports. For instance, if you had, investor commitments, or you were part of some sort of voluntary sustainability initiative, we can create those reports for you and we can make them accessible within your account. I think we've got another question. Specific state agencies often require online submissions. Does the Validere platform conform to the submissions, or is the data extrapolated? So I think the sort of specific answer to this depends on what type of submission we're talking about and which regulators. In some instances, regulators have very specific submission channels. In some cases, Validere has worked with clients to create basically report outputs that align with those specific, regulation channels. And so essentially what you get out of the platform is what you would put into the online submission pathway. At this time, we don't have direct integrations with a lot of basically like state submission portals, partially just because there's sort of I would say like a technical burden that falls on the regulators. So basically integrating with them would require a degree of involvement that we just haven't happened to get yet. But in terms of actually creating reports in the required format, that's what we focus on, and that's what we work with a lot of customers to ensure. Basically, the outputs of our system align with what they need to submit to the regulators, regardless of what that format is. So the answer is yes, we do align with essentially online reporting formats and online reporting standards. Perfect. I don't believe we have any other questions, so I think we'll call it there, but just want to say thanks once again for joining. I hope this was informative. I know we'll be sharing some follow-up material afterwards, so if you guys have any questions, certainly feel free to reach out to Max or myself or anyone else on the Validere team, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. So thanks very much, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.